Hey everyone, welcome to another edition of International Relations Online for UCSD's 2019 summer class. In this lecture, we're going to take a look at mechanisms of community mobilization. Unlike our lectures on individual mobilization and our lectures on macro causes of civil war at the country level, this lecture is going to take a look at the circumstances under which the contagion for a civil conflict spreads from a small group of individuals to a large group of individuals, and we see people in some localized community get mobilized to resist against a particular group. Here's a picture of a demonstration that occurred during Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution of 1989. This was one of a number of mostly bloodless revolutions that occurred in the very late 80s, very early 90s that saw the collapse of the Soviet Union. I'm sorry, not the collapse of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Iron Curtain and the end of Soviet influence in many, many countries in Eastern Europe. In his penultimate speech before his country, Romanian dictator Nicolae Ceausescu boasted that Soviet-style reform would end in his country when apples grow pears, or when apple trees grow pears. So historians are likely to record this phrase as the phrase that finally precipitated his fall. In the days that followed, students from Bucharest, theater and cinema students from Bucharest, hung all the pears that they could find in the barren, cold December trees that lined the capital's main street. This taunt so infuriated Ceausescu that he ordered his secretariat and secret police to identify the perpetrators of the prank and to attack students in their dormitory. The secret police pulled quite a number of students into the town square and executed them. But the following morning, when Ceausescu woke up, there were still pears in the trees. Someone had come out and hung more pears in the trees. So he ordered his Secret Service again to find the perpetrators. They hauled out even more students. This time I think they found some labor organizers as well and executed more people. Around 100 people that night were killed in the town square. And the next morning when Ceausescu woke up, there were pears hanging in the trees again, and he ordered his secret police one more time to go out and kill those who were responsible for this prank. But this time, the secret police and the army said no, and within 24 hours, Ceausescu had fled Romania on a helicopter for Moscow. So the puzzle then, obviously, is how these sorts of things happen. What was the trigger point? What changed the fate of Nicolae Ceausescu and the other dictators who lorded over Eastern European countries during the late 1980s? Why did communities put up with them for so long, and how did the rebellion finally spread? In other words, what causes these formerly docile communities to finally rise up? And why did no one predict the end of Soviet communism? This is particularly surprising. The speed with which anti-communist demonstrations and revolutions spread through Europe was a huge change in the entire world system, but almost no one among journalists or social scientists or movement leaders or locals on the street called it right. You've got some number of people, most people who were studying international relations at the time were obsessed with the Soviet Union and thinking about how the Soviet Union's political influence operated, particularly in Eastern Europe. And yet, basically no one called the Soviet Union was going to fall how and when it did. Even people who lived on the street in these places were shocked. Here you see in the quote, the Allenbach Institute asked, "A year ago, did you expect such a peaceful revolution?" And only 5% of people responded in the affirmative, right? That is an astonishingly small number of people to have predicted a revolution that many of them participated in, or at least their neighbors and their family members. In addition, basically no one thought that the Soviet collapse would be precipitated as the result of popular agitation. Here you see the only person who's sort of on record as calling it at around the right time, believed that the Soviet Union would collapse after a protracted war with China. So, how did we get this so wrong? In particular, how did we get the timing so wrong? Well, there are three major schools of thinking on revolutions that Curran thinks are in trouble based upon their failure to predict or really understand the greatest revolution of a generation. The first is the rational choice school. Rational choice makes a collective action argument. Things that solve collective action problems like side payments or political entrepreneurs that we discussed earlier in this series of lectures, or enforceable arrangements should precede revolutions. But we don't observe any sort of massive set of side payments. We don't observe the emergence of any sort of political entrepreneur or punishment mechanism that made it rational for people to suddenly participate in rebellion in Eastern Europe. Second, we have structural explanations. These explanations argue that changes in the international system or in the economy of the domestic country result in a change in the ability of elites to provide the services that they used to provide. Changes in the economy or changes in the international system gridlock the system of government. And so no longer can these elites afford to pay their friends who used to keep order for them. But this can't be the case either, Curran argued. This can't be the case because many Eastern European countries had not been providing services functionally for a very long time, and there was certainly no change in the extent to which Eastern European companies were able or unable to provide services in the days leading up to the revolution. So again, we see that there's no variation in the set of independent variables that we should see that predicts or associates with variation in the dependent variable of revolution. Lastly, we have relative deprivation arguments. These sorts of arguments predict that people react and revolt when their circumstances change for the worst. They'll put up with certain amounts of repression as long as the economy is good. This is, by the way, how some China watchers characterize the Chinese government's constant quest for double-digit growth. We will continue to put up with the Chinese government's repression of our human rights as long as the government is delivering growth. That's what we want the government to do, deliver growth and stability. Well, again, there was no large-scale change in the material deprivation that Eastern Europeans were experiencing at this time. Again, the sort of DDR zone was experiencing protracted economic stagnation under Soviet rule, and these things hadn't changed in any major way just preceding the revolution. Okay, so then what is Curran's theory? If Curran's going to help us understand these things, he's going to wipe away these old schools and replace them with something else. Well, of course we were surprised, he says. It was inevitable that we would be astounded when the revolution arises. Why? What is it about revolution that takes us fundamentally by surprise? And why does Curran argue that revolution will always take us by surprise? Well, the answer that Curran provides us with has to do with private information, private preferences, and information cascades. It's a process or a psychological bias that Curran refers to as preference falsification. Let's get into it here. The basic problem here is that opposing the government is costly. People that hate the government pretend to love it so that they can avoid punishment. And they keep their criteria, the triggering mechanism that would allow them or encourage them to reveal their hidden preference about hating the government, they keep that criteria a secret, which means there's a difference between their private views and their public ones, and this has really important implications for how we might expect a revolution to unfold. Curran notes that a person's private and public preferences often differ. We can go through each potential pair really quick before settling on the transition he thinks is most important. If we consider a world in which the state is strong and no one knows who secretly opposes it, no one knows who in the population hates the government, here's your set of outcomes. If you privately support the government, you can publicly support the government and everything is fine for you, right? That should be pretty obvious. If you privately support the government but publicly oppose, this doesn't make any sense, right? This would be irrational in Curran's view. Why would you open yourself up to punishment by the government from espousing a set of views that you don't actually hold? Here things start to get interesting. For the moment, we'll assume that people who show their opposition get targeted for jail or death. So what happens, the outcome that happens, if people privately oppose and publicly oppose the government, is that they get offed by the regime. But we do have this group of people who we know exist who privately oppose the government but support it in public. So what is this person thinking? What we care about mostly is whether the secret opposition becomes public, whether the secret opponent outs him or herself and joins the revolution. Because as more people join the revolution, the chances that it succeeds grows. And the chances that every new individual person who joins the revolution is actually punished with jail or death decreases, right? If there are only 10 people out chanting in Tahrir Square, it's relatively easy for the government to round them up and throw them in some sort of secret prison. But when you have 10,000 people or 100,000 people, or even as the protests in Egypt reached 1 million people, it's impossible to jail all of these people. It's not even possible to jail very many of them as a percentage. So what are these people thinking, right? The reason that they switch sides might not be entirely obvious. The cost of switching, the cost of revealing your private preference publicly, is maybe death. But what's the benefit? What game is this that already appeared in the literature review? The Curran argues that participating in a rebellion is, on its own, always a losing choice. The external costs are always going to exceed the external benefits. This looks a lot like a prisoner's dilemma or a collective action problem. The issue that we have here is that your private cost or your individual cost of getting caught is very high, but the chances that you are going to be the person who joins the rebellion and makes all the difference, that tips the country from being brutalized by a Soviet-style governance system into having free and open elections, is extremely unlikely. So why on earth might a person decide to join a rebellion? Curran theorizes that there are internal costs to pretending that you love a regime that you actually hate. A concept called cognitive dissonance, when you are forced to behave in a way that doesn't accord with your morals. This isn't minor, right? Think about the politician that you hate the absolute most, and imagine that you have to have a poster of them on your school locker, or that you shop in stores and there are constantly pictures of them, or cars driving through your community blaring sales pitches for their wonderful leadership over and over again. And this person or this person's party has actually injured you or injured your family or injured your friends, and you just have to put up with day after day after day smiling about how good this person is for your country. So over time, Curran argues that these internal costs, this cost of failing to act against a repressive regime that you hate, actually build up in your psyche. He also notes that external costs, which he terms S for his game, decrease as people join the opposition, right? So we know that our costs can be, our external costs for joining the revolution can be termed as the punishment for rebellion multiplied by the chance that you are actually going to get caught, right? So if the penalty is death and the government catches 80% of people that rebel against it in a certain context, the punishment then for, or the cost of joining the revolution is like 0.8 deaths which is obviously a pretty steep penalty for joining. But as the number of people, as we discussed before, as the number of people who join the revolution increases, your chances of receiving the punishment go down. And when there's only a handful of you, it's almost certain death. But when there are millions of you, it's extremely unlikely that you will face death. Some hundredth or thousandth of a percentage chance that you will be caught and punished for your involvement in this revolution. Now, all of a sudden, the cost of joining the revolution might start to look lower than the cost of staying out of it, if the cost of staying out of it is this continued queasy feeling that your actions aren't meeting your own morals. So even as the frustration cost of pretending to love the regime stays the same, the perception of the cost of participating falls as people join. As more people join the rebellion, more people are willing to join the rebellion. So there's a classic solution to a collective action problem happening here. So every single person knows what the cost is for fighting, given the percentage of people who oppose the regime publicly. But they assume that they are the only people who oppose the regime are the ones that they can see. Right? So when you're thinking about your external cost, when you're trying to decide how likely you are to be harmed if you join the revolution and balance that against how you feel having to publicly support a regime that you hate, you use the number of people who publicly oppose the regime as your metric for determining how dangerous joining the revolution is. We also see in Curran's theory that every person has a cost at which they fight. Every person who opposes the government will at some point see a revolution so large that their personal risk for participating in the revolution sinks below the value of the cost they feel for supporting the regime. So let's say, just to model this out, that we have some people, person 1, person 2, person 3, person 4. And we can assign each person a threshold at which the cost of fighting is low enough that they would rather participate in the rebellion. So start off by looking at person P1. This person hates the regime so much and is so frustrated by being forced to pretend that they love it that they will be willing to join a revolution against the government once 10% of people in the population appear to be opposing the government as well. Person 2 has a slightly higher threshold. They must not hate the government quite as much. They will join the revolution when 30% of people have joined. Let's really quickly notice person number 4 as well. This person actually supports the government. They don't feel any sense of cognitive dissonance. But at the point where 90% of the people are rebelling, person 4 is willing to pretend that they support the rebels. The good feeling that person 4 gets from supporting the government is no longer worth the abuse they get from their fellow citizens for saying that they do. Right? So as revolution sweeps the country, even people who previously supported the government are going to start to see that their support, their open support of the government, is going to put them in the same position that open opposition of the government used to put their rivals. So as the number of people who support the opposition grows, this group that didn't used to exist starts to exist. Suddenly you have people who pretend to oppose the government because they see the writing on the wall. They think it's possible that the government is actually going to fall. This tends to make revolutions really obvious in hindsight, because you have lots of people claiming that they supported the revolution the whole time, when in fact they didn't. They switched sides cynically. So when you do opinion polls about how many people hated the government, you get lots of people who are now willing to tell you their true preference, that they always oppose the government, and a group of people who are willing to lie to you about what their true preference had been because now they don't want to be outed as a supporter of the old repressive government. So let's say that we have a society called A. These are the people in society A, listed by what it takes for them to rebel, the threshold that they need to see of rebellion in society before they are willing to take the risk and join. Who rebels in this society? What happens to the revolution? Let's say you need 50% of people to rebel in order for the government to fall. Well, obviously the person who has a zero threshold rebels. They don't need to see anyone else in society rebelling. They hate the government so much, something so bad has happened to them, that they are willing to risk death in order to make it known that they oppose the government. If this person is the only one that rebels, the rebellion is quashed. Now let's say this guy gets shaken down by the cops or something. He gets mad. He hates the government even more. And he changes his mind about how many people he needs to see rebel before he would join. Now, in society A prime, who rebels? Well, we have the same person kick it off, right? This guy who needs no more invitation, which causes our new guy at 10% to join, and we can see that already there's someone at 20% and someone at 30% and 40% waiting. Because we have this new distribution of hatred of the government, this changed distribution, in this case, we start a revolutionary bandwagon that captures 80% of the population, and the government probably falls. Notice how close the revolutionary society is to the placid one. How close the distribution of dislike of the government is in the society where the rebellion succeeds compared to the society where the revolution fails. We would have known the whole time that society A was on the brink of revolution if we could have viewed the distribution of attitudes toward the government. If we had only known that we were one flip away from a successfully revolutionary society, we probably could have predicted that the revolution was coming. But we don't get to see these private preferences. People hold them very dear. They don't reveal them to others. So even if the older theories about revolution are somehow true, we won't know what event actually triggers the revolution because the dissatisfaction boiling beneath the surface is never enough. We need a change. We need a change in the dissatisfaction of one person or one group of people that brings them beneath the revolutionary threshold. But communication of these new public preferences is required to shift the downstream behavior, and we're never going to predict when that's going to happen because these preferences are private. Okay, a couple of discussion questions about Curran before we move on to Peterson. One thing you might want to consider is the extent to which Curran's theory affords an opportunity for revolutionary organizations. Why might an organization matter in creating a revolution? Well, one answer to this might be that if the revolutionaries are disorganized, if they are one-off taking the streets to protest and not coordinating, the revolution looks small. But if you have a group of dedicated revolutionaries who are willing to tack flyers up all over town or put up graffiti everywhere or get everyone mobilized for one protest, that's going to change the way that people who are near the revolutionary threshold view how many people are participating. So if you used an organized approach, your revolutionary organization looks bigger, which encourages people with a higher private preference, a higher private safety threshold to join. This question is one that we'll address in the next reading. What does Peterson argue that Curran misses about private preferences and predicting community mobilization? So we'll move on to that right now. Roger Peterson's Resistance and Rebellion. This is a picture of a handful of Lithuanian partisans who resisted Russian rule in the countryside of Lithuania for years following the war. Puzzle here. How do poorly armed communities decide to resist better armed states? And what are the mechanisms by which communities exchange information about private preferences? So notice that Peterson is problematizing an assumption that Curran made. Curran assumes that people don't ever communicate their private preferences about the government and about when they would join a rebellion, what they would need to see in order to join. What is your instinct? Do people actually keep these things totally private? Peterson, as we'll see, argues that people can't keep these things a secret. These are very emotional, important decisions and feelings that they have. And so they let people in their innermost circle know how they're feeling. And so we can, as social scientists, start to break down this assumption that Curran has, that we're never going to see these informational cascades occur because we can't view the private preferences. Okay, so why is it important to know the mechanisms by which communities exchange information about private preferences? Why is it important to know how poorly armed communities decide to resist better armed states? Well, one of the reasons that Peterson argues that we lost in Vietnam or fought to a stalemate in Vietnam is because we could never identify or isolate locally based support networks. We didn't know who was on the rebel sides because we didn't have any theory about how revolutionary ideas spread. Targeting insurgents is an immense challenge that implicates not only the ability to disrupt the organization itself, but implicates the number of innocent lives that gets lost, which has both moral implications and strategic ones. Uprooting insurgents requires understanding how civilian participants form supply chains to aid one combatant or another. We don't just want to know where the fighters are, we want to know where the people who are providing them with places to hide are. We want to know where the people who are providing them with food or taxes are. All right, Peterson's Lit Review. Peterson starts with a critique of the cross-national comparisons that we saw conducted in the readings by Collier and Hoffler and Fearon and Leighton. Peterson argues that this is pointless. You can't argue or ask whether oil affects the chances of rebellion and expect to have learned anything if you don't know how oil affects the community's structures or mechanisms. This read is maybe a little uncharitable. We probably did learn something from Collier and Hoffler, but these questions are framed differently. They aim themselves at a different unit of analysis. Why, Peterson asks, do we see mobilization against repressive regimes in some places in countries that experience civil war, but not others? By focusing their unit of analysis at the country level, Collier and Hoffler are by design unable to give us any sort of leverage on understanding this within-country variation. The recruitment literature, Humphreys and Weinstein, which you're reading for the next lecture, has similar failings. One problem with the standard recruitment literature is that it fails to perceive recruitment as a process in which an individual can play many roles. You don't leap from being a benign observer of a revolution into grabbing your gun and heading off into the woods in one fell swoop. You involve yourself in revolutionary politics slowly. You have opportunities to withdraw from revolutionary politics. So Peterson argues that there's a lot more complexity at work here on the individual level than our sort of recruitment literature takes into account. I'll argue for the rest of this lecture that Peterson makes two main contributions to our understanding of revolutions with a relatively complicated theory. The first contribution is that each individual can slide in and out of different roles in a conflict, and for this we consider the triggering and sustaining mechanism chart. The switch from every position on the chart to the next relies on a different set of mechanisms. First, let's define these roles. In the first +1 stage, Peterson asks if you accept or refuse propaganda, if you participate or fail to participate in propaganda events. So, for example, do you sing old folk resistance songs at church? Do you skip the Army celebration day in your village? Do you take pamphlets when revolutionaries hand them out on mass transit? This is the type of resistance that Peterson is talking about, and this type of graffiti, he argues, takes a lot of guts. Here are examples of the same sorts of agitation from the Cold War period. Pamphlets, banned literature that's been translated into the local language. The second stage asks if you join local organizations that resist. And these local organizations, Peterson argues, are by and large nonviolent. What they do is mobilize resources that allow for the mobile units of the revolution, the people who are actually doing the fighting, to sustain themselves. Are we providing taxes? Are we providing recruits? Are we providing secrecy and places to hide? This requires a more active involvement in the revolution, Peterson argues. +3 involvement then is when you actually take your rifle and head off from the village into war. Revisiting this graph, then, triggering mechanisms are the social forces that cause a person to move from one relationship with the rebellion to the next. What moves you from being neutral to being willing to take propaganda or participate in propaganda marches? What moves you from being willing to participate in propaganda to actively aiding a revolutionary organization? What moves you from active aid to straightforward violent participation? Sustaining mechanisms are likely different. These are the things that prevent a person from sliding back down the scale once they've achieved a certain level of participation. Here Peterson lists his mechanisms. We're not going to go through all of them in depth, but let's notice a couple right up front. This must sound familiar from Curran. Resentment formation. One of the things that encourages people to go from neutral to stage 1 is their sense of how much they hate the government. This is how much cost people assign to remaining neutral, how much they decide that they would hate themselves if they remained neutral. This tells you how much risk you would take in opposing the government. These are also similar from Curran. The calculation of risk occurs by looking at other people, but notice the difference between the +1 mechanism and the +2 mechanism. To make the decision about whether or not you're going to participate in public displays of mild disapproval of the government, you look at your entire society. Because if you're on the subway handing out pamphlets, that's who you're making yourself vulnerable to. Everyone can see you, they know that you're involved in some amount of subversion, and so you have to believe that the entire society is going to support you up to the level of your threshold in order to participate in these sorts of activities. However, when it comes to moving from +1 to +2, to joining an organization that provides material support to the rebels, you stop looking at all of society and you start looking at just your community. Why? Well, the answer is that your community can actually see whether you're participating in the rebellion in this way. Your neighbors know whether the rebels stop by your house at night to get food. Your neighbors know whether they're hiding in your storm cellar. The rest of society doesn't. You can keep the rest of society out. And so participating in a +2 movement only requires that the people who are in your community provide you with enough support or enough sense that you're not going to get caught. So it's a different set of standards. Let's consider these two really quickly because they implicate a thing that we're going to be talking about later and that's really worth talking about, the status considerations and the community-based norms of reciprocity. Peterson argues that strong communities can produce a couple of mechanisms which in a generally oppositional community, so in a place where lots of people have anti-government feelings, encourage participation in the rebellion. So strong communities that are opposed to the government are more likely to mobilize than weak communities that are opposed. Let's start off by asking, what is a strong community? Peterson adopts this position using some previous research by a social scientist named Michael Taylor, which emphasizes direct and multifaceted relationships between community members. What do we mean by direct and multifaceted relations? Well, pause for a second and ask yourself how many sides your relationship with me has. Presumably, you all answered one. We have a student-professor relationship. Think about what this means for how I am allowed to punish or encourage you for doing things that I approve or disapprove of. How many ways do I have to show my pleasure or displeasure with your political action? Right? I can raise or lower your grade. That's it. If I, for some reason, disapprove of your politics and we live in a world where that is contentious enough that I'm willing to take it out on you and your grade, that's the only thing I can do. And you can survive the class with a slightly lower grade or a slightly higher grade, or you can drop the class, or you can take more of my classes. But that is the extent of my ability to interfere in your life based on your politics. In a strong community where people have multiple relationships to one another, where your teachers are also farmers that sell food in the markets that you visit, where the farmers are also priests in your local religion who have the authority to marry you and your children, where your priests are also your friends because there are so few people that you have to be friends with your priests and your teachers and the people you buy from at the market. Now, if I disapprove of your politics, I can put pressure on you in a number of ways. I can stop coming to your house for dinner, robbing you of any type of society. I can charge you higher prices at the market instead of giving you my old friends and family discount. I can refuse to allow you to participate in local religious ceremonies. So once we have this ability in a society to pressure each other from multiple sides, Peterson argues, we can use that as leverage to create a couple of different ways that we can provide this pressure. So what are the roles of a strong community? The first is status rewards. If we live in a community that is by and large against the government, and some young hero sticks her neck out for the revolution, we can make her into a local hero. That's easy in a tiny Lithuanian village, in a way that it's not easy in a large city like San Diego. How do you communicate to everyone in our community, even at UCSD, who the heroes are? How do you get the message out? How do you get other people to agree with you? Relatively difficult in a large community where people only know each other along one dimension, but where we're a close, tight-knit group, we can lionize someone relatively quickly. Second is that we can build up norms of reciprocity, that is, our ability to guilt or shame someone for not sharing the burden when other people in the community are participating. And again, norms of reciprocity are stronger in communities that are small and that have multi-sided relationships, because there are multiple ways you can remind people that they are free-riding jerks. So how does this relate to Curran? Curran only considers the costs of fighting and staying out of the fight, Peterson argues. Peterson says you have to articulate variation in the reward structures as well. All these mechanisms that we're talking about here, the status rewards and the norms of reciprocity, push down the threshold of fellow participation that needs to obtain before a person will join the revolution. So these sorts of mechanisms represent an update to Curran, right? Many of Peterson's assumptions about how revolution works, much of his theory is similar to Curran. He believes that we keep these preferences private. He believes that there are security thresholds that need to be met before we will participate in a revolution. And he believes that there are cascades of information or participation that convince people that they're safe enough to finally join. But to this structure, he adds the idea that there are rewards for people who join the revolution when they are on the borderline of their threshold, of their safety threshold. And that in strong communities, we can generate these rewards in large enough effect to actually push people toward rebellion. The second contribution that Peterson makes to the study of mobilization at the community level is the idea that some communities within a country have different thresholds for action, and that if we can measure the different thresholds within each sub-community, we can start to predict when and where the revolution will start. Recall that for the 0 to +1 transition, we're looking at a whole society, but for the +1 to +2 transition, we're looking at our community-based reference. That means in any society, we have multiple possible revolutionary bandwagons. Each community creates its own threshold. In fact, you probably could argue that every person who has a unique set of others in their community not only has a private preference, but also has a set of groups that are constantly signaling to them about the preferences within that group. So we have multiple possible informational cascades. What does this mean for Curran's theory, right? Take this society, which has 12 people. If it takes 6 to overthrow the government, will they do it? Under Curran's rules, they only get 3, right? Then we hit these 50s who are not willing to rebel because they see that only 25% of the society has joined this +2 revolution. But if the reference groups are split into 2 sub-communities, we see that these people flip, and then the relatively liberal labor union flips entirely. Now we actually do have close to enough people to overthrow the government, and it happened just by splitting these groups of people into subgroups of communities that they trust more, subgroups of communities that may have internal mechanisms to punish and reward one another more completely. I should point out that my examples of the labor union as being the relatively liberal organization in post-Soviet revolutions and the Catholic Church being relatively conservative are not actually accurate. These are the 2 organizations that Curran believed were both really important for spreading revolutionary sentiment in the late 1980s. Peterson notes that the real power of revolutionary transition, the real ability of revolutionary individuals to spread their ideology happens when groups of strong communities overlap. In this example here, a pro-revolution group, B, overlaps more and more with a neutral group, which happens out of sight of the pro-government population. As the overlap increases, more and more of the neutral group, C, are exposed to the revolutionary thinking of the revolutionary group B. This eventually produces enough +2 activity that even some members of the pro-government group who are outside of the B and C groups flip. Notice the only thing that changes in these communities is the overlap, the number of people in the BC overlapping zone. The more people there are from B that are also in C doesn't change the thresholds of these groups, but it changes the ability of Group B to infect Group C with the contagion of revolution. So here, in this example, we have no overlap, and the rebellion gets 6 recruits. But say that the labor union and the church share some members. We can see now how the revolution spreads. It starts with the most revolutionary members of a radical union. Then in the second stage, the last union-only member flips. Now, those people who are members of both groups notice that their labor union brothers have entirely flipped. If 2 that are in this both side, that are in this both category, decide to flip, if the union has slightly more impact on them, then what we see is that the other 2 will flip. 75% radicalized, even though they are no more conservative than the radical church members who don't flip until the union church crossover is done. right? At which point now even the 75% member in the church is thinking about flipping. The radicalism moves like a contagion through group linkages, where when the groups were separate, the radicalization was really capped. Okay, so some discussion questions about Peterson quickly before we close out. How can we use Peterson's insight to predict when or how revolution will break out? Well, one of the central insights from Peterson's work is that we can think about finding radical groups with relatively low thresholds for rebellion and asking about whether they are embedded in strong communities where their membership overlaps greatly with more neutral seeming groups. These are the places we should expect to rebel first. These are the communities that should mobilize the fastest, because the spread of the revolutionary ideology is facilitated by the strength of the communities and by the amount of the overlap that we see between revolutionary and non-revolutionary groups. How should counterinsurgents target to prevent +2 action against the state? Well, if you want to ask the really cynical question, who do you target? The most straightforward answer from Peterson's work is that you ought to target individuals who overlap between revolutionary groups and more neutral groups. If you can take those people out of the equation, if you can divorce the revolutionary groups, take them out of the view of the neutral groups, then you can cap the revolutionary contagion inside the revolutionary groups. And Peterson's work has been used to this effect the world over, a fact about which I'm told Peterson feels pretty guilty. Okay, you have one lecture remaining if you're watching these in order. Our discussion of Humphreys and Weinstein and how individuals are recruited into insurgent action, how individuals make risky choices about participation. Once you're done with that, you are finished until I see you next week, when we can stop talking about violence and start talking about the determinants of international cooperation.